Let me tell you something, boss. If you think handling the dead under the clean glare of fluorescent strip lights is a grim trade, you wouldn't have lasted until midnight in the lower cellar of the St. Jude funeral house back in the summer of 1974. New Orleans didn't just have heat that year, it had a thick, greasy river humidity that settled into the cypress floorboards like old engine oil. The air in the basement was so heavy it felt like breathing through a wet wool blanket, forcing a suffocating, dense weight down into my chest that made my ribs ache with every desperate breath. My name is James. I was 26 years old, and my job was something the parish ledger called an aesthetic restoration operator. I wasn't a doctor, boss. I was a manual laborer working with iron spatulas, camel hair brushes, and large earthenware pots of thick medical sealing wax. The task was entirely mechanical and tedious. When a body came out of the bayou canals or the harbor fires with its features torn or blackened, the county didn't show the raw meat to the family. They sent them down the wooden ramp to my bench. I had to melt the gray petroleum wax over a small gas jet flame, build up the missing contours of the jaw or the cheekbones layer by layer, and paint the surface by hand until the skin looked like it was sleeping in a calm parish church. The cellar wasn't quiet, boss. It had a regular, low-frequency hiss that came from the brass gas lamps mounted along the cypress beams. The green-tinted glass globes hummed constantly as the fuel burned through the pipes, casting a sickly, flickering yellow glare over my restoration table. The smell was the worst part of the ledger. It wasn't just the carbolic acid of the formaldehyde, it was the sweet, suffocating stench of the heavy wax melting over the iron plates. It stuck to the lining of your nostrils until you could taste the grease in your morning coffee, a rancid, oily film that seemed to coat the back of my throat like rotting tallow. Make the jawline symmetrical, James, the chief embalmer told me before he locked the upper office doors for the evening. The family paid for an open crate viewing. They don't want to see the structural fractures from the river impact. I stood over the zinc table with my iron spatula in my left hand. The storm outside was just beginning to hit the levee, the heavy summer rain rattling against the high street-level iron grates like loose gravel. The water was already dripping down the lime-washed brickwork, pooling around the legs of my wooden stool. The humidity inside the room rose until the gray canvas shroud over the intake gurney was damp to the touch. This was the raw routine of the midnight shift, boss. A long, silent inventory of faces that only existed until the burial ground took them back. By 11 o'clock, the air had turned so thick the gas flames were shrinking inside their glass globes, compressing the narrow room into a tight, claustrophobic coffin of damp brick. I scraped the crust of old tallow off my workspace and reached for the intake slip. The county wagon had dropped the frame off an hour before the rain started. It was a man, 43 years old, pulled from the iron engine room of a burned Menhaden fishing boat out in the lower delta. The fire had taken the right side of his skull down to the bone structure, leaving a deep, blackened crater where the ear and the temple should have been, a horrific, jagged cavern of charred muscle and split, soot-caked bone that looked less like a human head and more like a mangled piece of butchered carrion, its split margins warped into a permanent, agonizing grimace of absolute horror. I hauled the heavy wood frame wax pot closer to the burner, the grease sizzling as the gray wax began to soften in the heat, giving off a rancid, blistering hiss that seemed to echo the silent, agonizing scream frozen forever onto the victim's ruined face, filling the dead air with a tense, nauseating pressure that screamed of unholy, violent destruction. The heat from the gas burner wasn't helping the room, boss. The river humidity was so dense it turned the blue gas flame into a lazy, sputtering orange cone that smelled of sulfur. I reached down with my bare hands to untie the coarse hemp twine holding the canvas shroud over the fisherman's shoulders. The cloth was stiff, crusted with dried salt water and the black soot of the engine room explosion. As I pulled the layer back, the smell of the bayou mud was completely driven out by the heavy odor of burned fuel oil. The right side of his face was a dark, hollow valley of carbonized tissue, a horrific, jagged cavern of charred muscle and split, soot-caked bone that looked less like a human head and more like a mangled piece of butchered carrion, its split margins warped into a permanent, agonizing grimace of absolute horror, a jagged abyss that seemed to bleed darkness into the room. The heat had drawn the muscles tight against the jawbone, locking his mouth into a narrow, rigid grimace that bared the white enamel of his teeth, a brutal, bone-shattering distortion that seemed to lock his face in a silent, eternal scream of unadulterated torment, a terrifying spasm that looked as though the bone itself were trying to rip free from the cooked flesh. I took my iron spatula from the rack. My fingers were slick with grease as I dug a large wedge of the raw petroleum wax out of the earthenware tub. The wax was cold, stiff, and the color of sheep tallow. To make it malleable enough for the skin, you had to work it between your palms, letting the natural heat of your own blood soften the base until it could be spread like butter. I kneaded the gray mass under the yellow glare of the gas lamp, my knuckles clicking in the heavy silence of the cellar. Outside, the New Orleans rain was coming down harder now, the water rushing through the street gutters above my head with a deep, hollow gurgle. The brick foundations of the funeral house were vibrating from the thunder over the river. I stepped closer to the zinc table, holding the softened lump of wax between my thumbs, ready to lay the first foundational layer over the blackened crater of the skull. The skin of the dead man should have been cold as a river stone, boss. He had been in the refrigeration box for 12 hours before they brought him to my bench. But the moment my thumb pressed the gray wax down into the hollow seam behind his jawbone, the tissue beneath didn't feel like dead muscle. It didn't resist the pressure. The burnt skin had a strange, greasy sponge-like quality that swallowed the wax instantly, a sickening, parasitic absorption that felt as if the lacerated flesh itself were ravenously drinking the grease down into its hidden, oozing core, sucking it deep into a starved, subterranean stomach. I pulled my fingers back, expecting to see the gray grease sticking to the black carbon. Instead, the surface was clean. The gray compound had completely disappeared into the charred flesh, leaving only a thin, glistening track of liquid moisture that looked like sweat, or perhaps a foul, putrid excretion from a weeping, necrotic wound that bubbled faintly with a cold, malevolent vitality. I held my breath, watching the yellow light flicker against his open teeth, feeling a tight, suffocating panic constriction wrap around my throat like a wet noose, cutting off my air until my head throbbed with a dark, heavy weight. The air in the room didn't move, but the smell of the melting tallow turned sharper, smelling less like medical grease and more like an old stovepipe after a chimney fire, a rancid, blistering stench of burning human fat that coated the back of my throat like thick, suffocating ash, choking my lungs in a greasy, black vice. I took a second, larger wedge of wax from the tub. My palms were sweating now from the suffocating humidity of the basement, my skin crawling in a claustrophobic trap of absolute, unholy terror, the walls closing in like a shifting brick coffin. I ignored the oily texture of the skin and began to rebuild the contour of the missing ear, smoothing the gray grease along the temple with the flat of my iron tool. Every stroke of the spatula felt heavy, the wax dragging against the carbonized bone as if it were trying to stick to something moving underneath, a sickening, muscular resistance that vibrated straight through the iron tool and into my arm bones, threatening to fracture my wrist under a sudden, terrifying, and malicious counter-pressure, a deep, grinding twitch from the depths of the marrow that signaled a hungry, waking wrath. The grease wouldn't stay firm under the iron spatula, boss. No matter how many times I scraped the gray compound across the edge of the tool to clear the excess, the surface of the restoration wouldn't take a smooth line. The gray tallow was behaving against the handbook rules. Instead of hardening into a solid, rubbery shell as it cooled against the cold bone of the skull, the wax was growing thinner and more aggressive. It was breaking down into a clear, oily, foul-smelling fluid that ran down the side of the fisherman's neck in long, yellow grease streaks that glistened like infection. I leaned down under the green-tinted globe of the gas lamp. The flame gave a long, regular hiss that vibrated right through the iron mounting bracket, rattling my skull. "The mix is off," I muttered to myself, my teeth grinding against the bitter, chemical taste of the carbolic steam. The supplier added too much rancid lard to the petroleum base to save on the summer shipment. I picked up the small alcohol torch from the chemical shelf. In 1974, when the humidity locked the cellar air, we used a direct blue flame to glaze the surface of the restoration, searing the outer layer of grease to lock the skin coloring in place before the funeral viewing. I struck the match against the weeping brickwork and touched the wick. The small blue cone of light popped into life, casting a cold, sharp, unforgiving glare over the dead man's nose. But as I brought the flame within 3 inches of his rebuilt temple, the flesh beneath the gray layer didn't react like cold meat. The pores along the edge of the unburned skin, where the live tissue met the carbonized, charred crater, began to swell and convulse. They didn't just open up from the ambient heat of the room, boss. They were producing tiny, rapid, frantic bubbles of clear, boiling liquid that broke through the gray wax like steam escaping a pressurized, hellish laundry vat. The grease was being violently pushed outward from the inside of the skull, forced out by an unnatural, surging pressure. It was a slow, mechanical, and horrifying rejection of the material, the gray compound listing and sliding off the cheekbone in heavy, wet, sickening clumps that hit the table with a wet, squelching thud. I pulled the torch back, my heart hammering like a trapped bird against my ribs. My hand was shaking so badly the blue flame licked the sleeve of my work shirt. The heat wasn't coming from my alcohol lamp, boss, it was coming from the zinc table itself. I laid the palm of my left hand down on the metal rim of the gurney, right beside the fisherman's shoulder. The heavy zinc plate, which should have been freezing from the subsurface drainage pipes, was searingly, impossibly warm to the touch. It felt like the iron deck of a river barge after 12 hours under the August sun, a heat that burned through my calluses and made the very air around it shimmer with distortion. The temperature was rising through the iron legs of the table, turning the condensation on the metal into a thick, bubbling, acidic froth that smelled of scorched river weeds, rotting fish, and putrid engine grease. I looked back at the fisherman's eye socket. The lid had been burned away by the ship fire, leaving the milky white sphere of the eyeball exposed to the harsh, yellow gaslight. The lens of the eye was dry and clouded like a dead, sightless fish, but the fluid inside the chamber was turning a deep, bruised black. A thin, steaming, red thread of fresh, vibrant blood was rising from the tear duct, cutting through the gray wax layer on the cheekbone and sizzling, literally sizzling, as it hit the boiling, hot zinc plate below. The silence in the lower bunker grew heavier, plugging my ears until the sound of the New Orleans storm outside was reduced to a distant, muffled, agonizing thud, like a coffin lid being hammered shut. The only sound left was the internal, rhythmic bubbling of the wax pots on the stove. They were ticking and popping like breaking bones as the grease expanded, the gray surface turning dark as it absorbed the unnatural, malignant heat rising from the table. I reached for the iron scraper again, my fingers slick and trembling with the melted, bubbling grease, knowing with a jolt of pure, paralyzing dread that if I didn't clear the boiling, rupturing pour before the midnight inspection, the registry clerk would mark the frame as a total, monstrous loss, and whatever was animating this cooling carcass would finally recognize me as the only other living thing in the room. The heat coming off that zinc table was a physical offense, boss, an atmospheric assault that made the very air feel like it was being scorched. It wasn't the soft, heavy, cloying warmth of a Louisiana summer night, it was a dry, mechanical, and malevolent radiation that felt like standing too close to the open, roaring firebox of a river locomotive. The grease on my spatula was completely liquid now, turning into a scalding, translucent slick that dripped off the iron edge onto my boots in clear, boiling drops that left sizzling white rings of cauterized leather, searing right through the hide. I picked up the heavy iron scraper to clear the whole mess back into the bucket, but the tool wouldn't bite into the flesh. It skittered across the surface as if the man's face were made of greased glass. The moment the iron edge touched his cheekbone, the melted wax layer under the gaslight didn't just slide off, it began to turn over on itself with a sickening, wet friction. It was a slow, oily rotation, the gray, necrotic sludge churning in small, localized, agonizing circles like thick river mud bubbling over a deep, hidden drainage pipe. The surface was bubbling faster now, the clear grease turning a dark, muddy, bruised brown as it violently mixed with the black, charred carbon ground into the bone, smelling of burnt hair and liquefied marrow. And then, the geometry of the restoration changed completely, defying every rule of anatomy and logic. The gray mass on the right side of the skull, where I had carefully smoothed the contour of a normal ear, began to reshape its own margins with a predatory intent. The sludge didn't run down the neck anymore, it began to crawl upward, against the cruel law of gravity, pulling itself toward the center of the man's forehead in thick, waxy, trembling ribbons that looked like pale, blind worms burrowing under his very skin. It wasn't a random slide, boss, the grease was tracking across the bone with a precise, mechanical, and horrifying direction, splitting into small, finger-like tracks that left deep, gouging grooves in the unburnt skin, as if he were trying to claw his way out from behind his own face with invisible, desperate fingers. The skin itself began to tear, splitting open in jagged, weeping fissures. I dropped the iron scraper. The heavy metal tool hit the concrete floor with a loud, ringing, tomb-like clang that rattled the empty specimen jars on the lower shelves, a sound that seemed to shatter the fragile silence of the bunker. I backed away 2 steps until my hips hit the sharp edge of my wooden work stool, my breath coming short, jagged, and fast, the air inside my lungs tasting like old, rancid tallow and choking, dry soot. Under the sickly green glass globe of the gas lamp, the fisherman's face was shifting under the mud. The gray wax was thickening again, but it wasn't cooling down. It was gathering into small, tight, pulsating knots across his forehead and nose, hardening into jagged, alien shapes that didn't belong to the registry of the dead, shapes that screamed of a consciousness demanding to be recognized, a face warping into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The white enamel of his teeth, which had been locked into that rigid, burned grimace, began to sink back into the gray, heaving sludge, the gums swelling and rupturing like overripe fruit. The mouth was opening wide under the grease, the jaw dropping down 3 inches with a wet, tearing sound until the bone structure cracked sharply and sickeningly against the zinc sheet, the tendons snapping one by one like dry kindling. From the center of that opening, gaping mouth, a thick, searing, white line of high-pressure steam shot straight up into the yellow glare of the lamp. It didn't dissipate into the ceiling beams, boss. It hung over the table in a tight, spinning, screaming column, filling the lower cellar with a high-frequency, piercing whistle that sounded like a massive boiler pipe failing under the river, a sound that threatened to burst my eardrums and liquefy my resolve. The smell of the bayou mud was gone entirely, replaced by the suffocating, nauseating stench of a living, hungry furnace working with a terrible, frantic intensity right beneath the dead man's ribs, the heat so intense it began to blister the paint on the walls, turning the entire room into a pressure cooker of unholy, visceral terror where the line between a corpse and a machine had been violently, screamingly erased. The white column of steam didn't thin out in the damp air of the cellar, boss. It stayed tight, dense, and oily, spinning directly beneath the green glass globe of the gas lamp until the copper fixture itself began to rattle against the cypress ceiling beams. The high-frequency whistle from the fisherman's open mouth vibrated through the metal frames of my workbench tools, causing the iron files and the fine camel hair brushes to dance blindly against the wet wood. I backed up until the small of my back was pinned against the lead-shielded cabinet where we kept the concentrated embalming fluids. My breath was a short, ragged gasp that burned my throat with the taste of vaporized lard and old ship soot. The gray sludge on the zinc gurney was no longer just pooling, boss. It had achieved a thick, muscular consistency under that suffocating humidity. The gray tallow began to draw itself together into distinct, localized mounds across the dead man's face, rising and falling with a slow, rhythmic motion that looked exactly like a pair of small, leather lungs working beneath a wet canvas tarp. The grease wasn't trying to resemble a fisherman anymore. It was forming an entirely new topography over the burned skull. Right before my eyes, the mounded grease began to divide. A deep, vertical seam split the center of the wax on his forehead, pulling back in two clean ribbons to reveal a cluster of small, irregular shapes hardening beneath the surface. They weren't cheekbones or brow ridges, boss. They were faces. Miniature, hyper-detailed human features were projecting themselves outward through the gray grease like wooden carvings being shoved through soft river mud from the inside. On the left temple, a tiny, waxy mouth opened up, its lips pulling back into a perfect, agonized circle as if it were screaming for air under a heavy layer of river silt. Right next to it, along the bridge of the nose, three separate pairs of small, clouded eyelids rolled back into the grease, their tiny white pupils fixed directly on the ceiling beams. Every single one of the miniature faces was locked in a state of absolute terror, their features twisting and straining against the thick oil that held them captive. The gray sludge was a crowded ledger of shadows, boss. It looked like a whole crew of men had been melted down into a single gallon of grease, and now they were all fighting for the surface of the skin at the exact same microsecond. The mouths of the tiny wax faces were moving in silence, their waxy jaws clicking together with a dry, mechanical cadence that sounded like a dozen telegraph keys operating simultaneously in an empty office room. The heat radiating from the zinc table grew so intense the green glass globe around the gas lamp began to crack. A long, hair-thin fracture raced down the side of the glass with a sharp, crystalline ring, allowing a small jet of unburned orange gas to escape into the room. The ambient temperature in the lower bunker hit 95 degrees within seconds, the moisture on the cypress floorboards turning into a low, white mist that rose to my knees. I reached blindly to my right, my numb fingers searching the supply shelf for the heavy iron mallet we used to break the salt blocks for the cooling bins. My hand was shaking so violently I knocked over two earthenware jugs of carbolic wash, the red liquid splashing across the concrete floor and mixing with the rising mist in long, bloody streaks. I had to strike the frame, boss. I knew the rules of the aesthetic ledger. If a restoration achieved an independent geometry before the registry clerk signed the book, you didn't try to clear the plate with a spatula. You broke the structural support before the alignment locked into the masonry of the room. But as my fingers finally closed around the cold iron handle of the mallet, the main mass of the wax on the table stopped its rotation. The miniature faces on the forehead froze in mid-scream, their tiny waxy lips turning rigid as the gray compound began to turn an ash-white color from the margins inward. The white steam column inside the fisherman's throat died down instantly, leaving the cellar in a sudden, heavy silence that felt like 4 feet of river mud pressing down on the drums of my ears. The dead man's mouth remained stretched open, a dark, empty hole in the center of the white grease, waiting for the air in the room to shift back into the slot. The sudden silence in the lower bunker was worse than the boiler whistle, boss. It was the kind of heavy, dead stasis that hits the swamps outside the city right before a hurricane tears the roofs off the parish houses. The only sound left in the room was the steady, regular hiss of the leaking gas jet behind the cracked glass globe, dropping a dull, yellow smudge of light over the zinc table. My fingers were locked around the cold handle of the iron mallet, my knuckles white and slippery with the condensation running down the supply shelf. I didn't move an inch. I kept my back pinned flat against the lead-shielded cabinet, my boots frozen into the red carbolic puddle on the floorboards. The air inside the room was so thick with the smell of vaporized lard and old engine soot that it felt like inhaling hot lead, every breath scraping against the lining of my throat like dry sand, choking my lungs in a greasy, black vice that threatened to suffocate me where I stood. On the table, the ash-white wax layer had stopped its motion entirely. The miniature faces on the forehead were frozen solid now, their tiny, agonized features resembling a collection of pale clay masks pressed into a river bank. Then, the dead fisherman's left arm moved. It wasn't a slow, post-mortem contraction, boss. It wasn't the lazy twitch of a muscle releasing its final chemical charge. The arm, which had been lying perfectly flat and stiff along the zinc sheet since the county wagon dropped the frame, shot outward with a violent, mechanical velocity. The blackened, salt-crusted fingers tore right through the gray canvas shroud, scattering the wet fibers across the room like loose hemp. Before I could even lift the iron mallet from the shelf, those burnt, leathery fingers closed around my right with an unnatural, terrifying strength, a brutal, bone-crushing violence that locked around my flesh like a vice. The grip didn't feel like dead bone and meat, boss. It felt like a pair of iron tongs that had been heated in a blacksmith's forge and clamped directly onto my skin. The intense radiation coming off his black knuckles shot straight through the sleeve of my work shirt, turning the hairs on my forearm to ash in a fraction of a second. The heat was so immediate and sharp it bypassed my nerves entirely, leaving a deep, white line of scorched skin where his fingers bit into my flesh, a sickening, blistering lesion that boiled my blood within the veins. I let out a ragged, choked cry, the sound dying in my throat as the sheer pressure of his grip squeezed the bones of my together until the joints popped like dry twigs, splintering into agony under a sudden, terrifying, and malicious counterpressure. Let go of the line. I screamed into the yellow glare of the gas lamp. I swung the iron mallet down with my left hand, aiming straight for the center of his elbow joint to break the lever. But the moment the heavy iron head made contact with the bone, there was no sound of fracturing wood or cracking meat. The mallet bounced off his dead arm with a dull, metallic ring, the vibration running up my left shoulder and knocking the tool clean out of my fingers. The dead man didn't flinch. He didn't shift his torso on the table. Instead, the ash-white wax layer on his face began to melt all over again, the temperature under his skin surging past the boiling point. The miniature faces dissolved back into the central mass, their waxy mouths opening one last time to release a soft, warm vapor that smelled heavily of dried lavender, wet river mud, and rotting ship timbers, a rancid, blistering stench of burning human fat that coated the back of my throat like thick, suffocating ash. Through the center of that bubbling white grease, a low, muffled voice began to scrape its way out of his throat. It didn't use the air from his lungs, boss. It used the vibration of the melted wax itself, the sound shaping into a dry, whistling hiss that rattled the iron teeth of my spatulas against the workbench, a deep, grinding twitch from the depths of the marrow that signaled a hungry, waking wrath. The skin is gone, James, the collective chorus whispered right through the burning grip on my flesh. Asterisk, the boiler took the crew before the registry could mark the log. The fire needs a young layer to cool the bone. Hold the frame still. Asterisk. The pull from that scorched arm wasn't a simple tug, boss. It was a rhythmic, suctioning drag that felt like a bottomless, hungry mud hole at the mouth of the bayou, drawing my entire torso down over the edge of the zinc table with the relentless force of a hydraulic press. I fought against the leverage, my leather boot heels skidding through the carbolic wash and the wet, suffocating white soot on the floorboards, but my strength meant absolutely nothing against the dead, impossible weight of that engine room iron. My right wrist was trapped in his black, carbonized tongs, and the heat from his knuckles was no longer just burning the skin, it was sinking deep into the marrow, charring the bone from the inside out. I could feel my own pulse vibrating inside his dry, rigid fingers. Every time my heart threw a drop of blood down my forearm, the hellish heat of the fisherman's hand met it halfway, transforming the fluid into something thick, slow, and sickeningly heavy. The sensation was paralyzing, boss. It felt like my veins were being hollowed out and poured full of searing, liquid paraffin straight from the boiling, industrial pot. Under the cracked glass globe of the gas lamp, the ash-white wax on his skull was turning into a complete, churning, necrotic soup. The gray tallow didn't run off the edges of the gurney this time. It began to rise up his blackened neck like a heavy, industrial tide, swallowing the charred crater of his ear and sealing the deep, splintered fractures of his jawbone in a single, greasy, pulsating sheet. The small, agonized clay faces that had dissolved a minute ago were replaced by something much larger, something far more sinister. The entire surface of the melting, bubbling mass began to mirror the likeness of my own face, boss, a mirror made of gore and grease. The sludge was pulling the image right out of my skull through the agonizing connection of our locked wrists, ripping the identity from my nerves. I watched in the yellow glare as a perfect, waxy, blasphemous mold of my own nose, my own chin, and my own left eyelid rose out of the boiling, festering sludge. It was an exact, mocking inversion, a pale, blank duplicate of my skin being stamped into the hot, rancid lard by some unseen, heavy-duty hydraulic press screaming beneath the table. "The registry needs a clean sheet, James," the multi-layered, rasping his scrape through the bubbling grease of his new, synthetic mouth, sounding like dry leaves skittering over a tombstone. The waxy, melting lips of my duplicate moved in perfect, horrific synchronization with the whistling steam from his throat. The fishing boat went down with 5 men in the dark, but the ledger only holds 4 numbers. You have to sign the skin to balance the line for the night. The pain in my forearm turned from a localized, searing burn into a cold, drilling, necrotic numbness that traveled straight up into my collarbone, paralyzing my chest. I looked down at the point of contact where his black leather fingers met my wrist. The boundary line between our bodies was disappearing, boss, blurring into a wet, singular mass of rot. The gray petroleum grease from his face was crawling down his own arm in thick, rhythmic, vein-like pulses, tracking across his carbonized knuckles and hopping onto the skin of my hand like parasitic leeches. The wax was eating my shirt sleeve, dissolving the blue cotton threads into a sticky, black oil that smelled of scorched laundry starch and burning hair. Wherever that grease touched my bare skin, my flesh turned a flat, bloodless, corpse-like ash gray. The pores of my own wrist were opening up now, producing those same tiny, rapid, frantic steam bubbles I'd seen on his temple, as if my own blood were starting to boil in the presence of his rot. I could feel my own skin softening, liquefying under the oil, the solid, working muscle of my arm losing its structure and turning into a malleable, clay-like compound that I could have reshaped with a common iron spatula like warm putty. I let out a raw, broken, primal scream that shook the brass gas pipes along the cypress beams, a sound of absolute, fracturing terror. The gas flame gave a loud, wet pop, the long fracture in the glass globe splitting wide open and dropping a jagged piece of green crystal straight into the red, congealing puddle at my feet. I had to sever the optical path, boss, or I would cease to be. I knew if that waxy, parasitic duplicate on his skull achieved a permanent, total alignment with my own features before the gas fuel ran out, the transmutation would lock my coordinates into the St. Jude inventory for good, leaving me as a permanent resident of the lime trenches. My left hand scrambled wildly behind my back, my bleeding, trembling fingers sweeping across the top of the chemical shelf. They knocked over a box of eye pins and a jar of wash, showering the floor in glass, before my knuckles finally hit the cold handle of the manual bone saw. The handle of that manual bone saw was the only cold thing left in the entire cellar, boss. It was a heavy, industrial frame made of unpolished steel, its cross-cut teeth dull from years of tearing through the dense, waterlogged bone of river floaters. My left hand gripped the cross-hatched wood handle so hard the grain bit into my palm, but I couldn't feel the splinters. My entire right arm was already a dead, gray territory, losing its sensory ledger to the rising tide of petroleum grease, rotting from within under a horrific, parasitic absorption that turned my living meat into mush. I hauled the steel frame out from the clutter of the shelf, the long blade screeching as it dragged across the stone rim of the sulfur bin. The fisherman's grip on my wrist didn't loosen when I brought the steel down. His blackened knuckles remained clamped around my radius like a set of iron rivets that had been driven through the flesh and welded directly into the core of the bone, a brutal, bone-shattering distortion that ground my wrist joints into splintered shards. The ash-white wax on his face, which was now an exact, terrifying duplicate of my own features, swelled outward as if trying to meet the blade. The waxy lips of my mirror image pulled back, bearing the dead fisherman's yellow teeth in a wide, mocking grin that didn't belong to the living world, a grotesque, bleeding distortion of my own identity. "The steel won't clear the plate," James, the collective chorus hissed from the center of the turning sludge. The sound was so dry now it felt like a handful of parched river weeds being rubbed together right inside my own ear canal. Asterisk, the ledger is already signed in the marrow. You can't cut the line when the grease has already taken the alignment. Asterisk. I didn't answer the voice, boss. In 1974, when you work the lower shifts in the French Quarter, you learn that talking to the inventory only seals the contract. You keep your teeth clenched and you rely on the weight of the metal. I brought the saw-toothed blade down with all the weight of my left shoulder. I didn't aim for the dead man's wrist, there wasn't enough solid matter left in his carbonized tissue to hold a line. I aimed straight for the point of contact, where his black, leathery fingers were melting into the ash-gray skin of my own arm. Crunch. The steel teeth didn't bite into solid bone. They hit a thick, resistant layer of semi-hardened petroleum and lard that gave off a loud, wet suctioning sound as the blade went through, tearing through a rancid, blistering cavern of liquefying tissue and boiling human marrow. A wave of intense, suffocating heat shot up the frame of the saw, turning the steel blade an oxide blue color within seconds. The smell that erupted from the groove was an absolute offense. It was the stench of a grease fire inside a rendering house, mixed with the sharp, carbolic sting of vaporized formaldehyde, a suffocating, dense weight that choked my lungs in a greasy, black vice. The gray sludge on his face reacted violently to the iron breach. The duplicate features of my nose and jawline collapsed instantly into a chaotic wheel of spinning grease, the waxy flesh bubbling and running down his chin in long, smoking streams. The miniature clay faces on his forehead reappeared for a split second, their tiny mouths gaping wide as they sucked the white steam back into the skull, before they too were dissolved by the thermal backlash of the steel. But the grip didn't release, boss. The harder I dragged the saw through the waxy seam, the deeper his fingers sank into my graying flesh, a terrifying, malicious counterpressure threatening to rip my arm completely out of its socket. The grease was tracking up the blade itself now, a thick, dark ribbon of oil crawling along the steel teeth toward my left hand like a colony of hungry water leeches. My left thumb turned numb where it pressed against the wood bolster, the skin blanching into that same bloodless, stone-gray hue that had already taken my right elbow. The New Orleans rain above the grates gave a sudden, explosive roar as the center of the storm hit the river. A massive sheet of muddy canal water broke through the iron bars of the street chute, cascading down the lime-washed bricks in a heavy, gray waterfall that hit the corner of my workbench. The cold spray hissed violently against the warm zinc gurney, filling the cellar with a secondary cloud of white mist that completely swallowed the yellow glare of the dying gas lamp. The cold canal water breaking through the street chute didn't cool the cellar down, boss. It was a catalyst for a nightmare. The moment that muddy, freezing torrent hit the side of the warm zinc gurney, it was like throwing glacial pond water into a boiling, pressurized tar bucket. A massive, concussive wave of searing, white steam erupted from the iron legs of the table, billowing up to the cypress ceiling with a sharp, pneumatic roar that blew the remaining glass globes of the gas lamps into 1,000 green, lethal splinters that showered down like rain. The room went completely dark, save for the raw, naked orange jets of gas whistling from the broken brass pipes like tiny, angry, hell-sent blowtorches, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping fingers. In that flickering, orange twilight, the mist turned into a suffocating, dense shroud. It smelled of raw river mud, biting sulfur, and the sweet, nauseating, rotten tang of old, rancid tallow being boiled down for the winter candles. I was completely blind, my eyes stinging, weeping, and burning from the caustic, acid-laced steam, my left hand still gripping the cross-hatched wood handle of the bone saw with a white-knuckled, frantic desperation. I couldn't see my right arm anymore, boss. But I could feel it, or rather, I could feel it being erased. The numbness had traveled past my shoulder now, locking my collarbone into a rigid, icy, agonizing knot that made every ragged breath feel like I was inhaling crushed glass and needles. The fisherman's grip was no longer just a hand on my wrist. The waxy, parasitic transmutation had crawled so far up my forearm that our flesh was merging, liquefying, and welding together into a single, continuous, pulsing trunk of gray, corrupted petroleum sludge. The steel saw was wedged deep into that waxy seam, stuck fast by the hardening, boiling lard that seemed to be actively feeding on the iron. "The water can't wash the book, James," the multi-layered, grinding chorus bellowed out of the impenetrable dark. The voice didn't come from the table this time, it was vibrating right through the very floorboards beneath my boots, a low-frequency hum that turned my bowels to water, as if the entire, cursed foundations of the St. Jude funeral house were speaking through the grease. Asterisk, the Delta took 5 of us down into the engine room, and the river don't leave an odd number in the log. Drop the steel and let the wax finish the face. Asterisk. I felt a sudden, terrifying, sickening slackness in my right shoulder, a sensation of the bone simply dissolving into jelly. My arm was losing its skeletal structure completely, turning into a bag of heavy, dead meat. Through the thick, swirling white mist, I could see the outline of the fisherman's gurney shifting. The dead man wasn't lying flat anymore. His charred, ruined torso was lifting off the zinc sheet, pulled upward by the mechanical, twitching contraction of the hardening wax. The gray, bubbling sludge on his skull was expanding, reaching out through the dark like a blind, fleshy, probing vine, tracking along the oxide blue blade of the saw toward my left hand with a speed that defied nature. I knew the handbook rule for a runaway chemical breach, boss, but the rules felt like paper shields against a hurricane. If the alignment takes the operator's shoulder before the ledger is signed, you don't look for a knife, you use the chemical gravity of the room to break the suction before it pulls you into the abyss. With a desperate, blind, adrenaline-fueled lurch, I threw the entire dead weight of my torso to the left, dragging my lifeless right arm and the fisherman's locked, searingly hot hand with me. My boots skidded through the bloody, viscous carbolic puddle, losing their purchase completely on the slick, wet concrete. We went over the edge together, crashing down into the heavy, rotting timber supply racks beneath the workbench with a force that rattled my teeth. The impact was a chaotic, bone-jarring wreck of shattering glass, splintering wood, and the wet, heavy sound of meat hitting stone. My left shoulder smashed into the lower shelf where we kept the 5-gallon stoneware carboys of concentrated nitric acid, the heavy, volatile clearing agent used to strip the old wax from the iron pots after a winter restoration. The thick, brittle pottery jugs shattered against the floorboards with a dull, heavy thud, spilling gallons of the raw, smoking, and violently reactive acid straight into the mud and the sludge at our feet, turning the floor into a hissing, bubbling pit of chemical fire that threatened to consume everything that remained. The concentrated nitric acid didn't just spill, boss, it erupted with a terrifying, emerald green hiss the second it made contact with the carbolic puddle and the melting, rancid lard at our feet. The reaction was immediate and blinding, a violent chemical seizure that turned the floor into a roiling, bubbling cauldron. A thick, choking cloud of toxic, copper-colored vapor rolled out from under the broken timber racks, turning the orange twilight of the gas jets into a dark, suffocating chemical fog that made my eyes feel like they were being rubbed with coarse, jagged salt. I was lying flat on my back in the slush, my left shoulder pinned beneath a shattered, splintered cypress support beam, my breath coming in ragged, whistling, agonizing gasps that tasted of pure, biting vinegar and scorched iron. The acid hit the fisherman's locked arm first. The leathery, carbonized tissue didn't just dissolve, it screamed. It wasn't a human voice, boss, but the high, agonizing, mechanical screech of rusted iron under a high-speed friction wheel as the caustic green liquid shredded through the layers of river soot and hardened, putrid fat. The black fingers that had been welded into my radius began to blister, peel, and flake away like dry, brittle ash in a gale. The intense, drilling heat that had been pouring into my marrow suddenly reversed its course, transforming into a freezing, paralyzing vacuum as the acid tore the necrotic connection apart with raw, chemical violence. Pop, pop, snap. One by one, the 5 burnt, jagged rivets of his knuckles gave way under the chemical feast, the tendons snapping like over-tightened violin strings. The structural lever was broken at last, the dead arm falling back onto the concrete floor with a heavy, wet, sickening splash as the nitric acid consumed the muscle down to the gray, porous marrow of the bone. But the danger wasn't secured, boss. The gray petroleum sludge that had crawled onto my own wrist was still alive, and it was reacting to the acid with a violent, independent, predatory frenzy. The wax on my forearm didn't run off, it began to harden with an unnatural, rocky velocity as the chemical vapor stripped the moisture out of the grease. The ash-gray skin beneath my sleeve was thickening into a rigid, waxy crust that looked exactly like the warty, scabrous bark of an old, dying bayou willow. I could feel my fingers, my own living fingers on my right hand, turning stiff, white, and completely non-reactive as the petroleum compound locked the joints into a permanent, frozen, agonized curve, locking me in a grip of cold, unyielding wax. Through the shifting, swirling green fog, the fisherman's headless, wax-covered torso was still twisting on the floorboards beside me, driven by the rhythmic, muscular contractions of the remaining, heated lard. The gray soup that had taken the likeness of my own face was bubbling in the dark, acidic mud, the waxy lips of my duplicate opening wide to spit out a final, desperate, scalding column of white steam. The features were melting and reforming with every agonizing second that passed, trying to claw their way back up the leg of my wooden stool to find a fresh layer of unburnt skin before the acid cleared the floorboards for good, a faceless thing reaching for a new vessel. The number is still short, James, the collective, distorted whisper was fading now, the sound turning thin, gravelly, and wet as the green liquid dissolved the vocal tracts in his throat, turning his speech into a bubbling, gargling mess of acidic foam. Asterisk, the river doesn't leave an open line in the log. If the wax dries before the viewing, you'll have to sit in the crate yourself, forever cold and forever waiting. Asterisk. I didn't let the shadow finish the count. With a brutal, unyielding, panic-driven effort, I used my left hand to grab a handful of the dry white magnesium powder that had spilled from the upper shelf during the crash. I didn't look at the searing burn eating through my sleeve, I threw the entire fistful of raw oxide dust straight into the middle of the smoking, hissing acid pool between my knees, praying that the sudden, violent alkaline reaction was the only thing that could neutralize the feast before the green liquid took my own ribs down to the ledger and etched my name into the St. Jude floorboards for eternity. The magnesium powder hit the pooling nitric acid with a violent, blinding, magnesium white pop that lit up the entire damp, rotting perimeter of the cellar like a jagged, indoor lightning strike, boss. The chemical flash was a brutal assault of pure, sterilizing radiance that lasted for a single, fracturing second, casting long, skeletal, agonizing shadows of the timber racks against the lime-washed brickwork. The reaction created a violent, hissing alkaline heat that instantly neutralized the green acid feast, turning the boiling, emerald puddle into a thick, gritty, chalky white paste that hissed and hardened as it solidified against the concrete floorboards like a thickening tomb. The silence that followed was absolute, boss, a suffocating, heavy, dead silence that pressed against my eardrums like deep water. The high-frequency boiler whistle inside the dead fisherman's throat was gone entirely, choked off by the sudden, brutal calcification of the grease. The only thing left in the dark was the steady, rhythmic drip-drip-drip of the muddy, stagnant river water still leaking through the iron bars of the street chute above my head. The raw orange gas jets on the broken pipes gave one last wet, pathetic splutter and died out, leaving the lower bunker plunged into the cold, gray, tomb-like twilight of the New Orleans dawn. I lay there in the damp, freezing, chemical white slush for 10 minutes, my chest heaving against the suffocating, toxic weight of the lingering chemical fog. My left hand was still shaking, my fingers raw, torn, and bleeding where the jagged splinters of the cypress beam had shredded the skin, but it was my right arm that held the true, terrifying ledger of the night. I dragged my broken body up from beneath the shattered timber rack, my bad knee popping with that dry, mechanical friction as I forced my legs to take my trembling weight against the concrete. I lifted my right arm into the pale, sickly gray light filtering through the coal chute. The gray petroleum sludge had stopped its migration, boss. The magnesium flash had baked the compound right into my tissue with searing intensity, turning the entire forearm from the elbow down into a rigid, ash-white, ghastly cylinder of calcified grease. It was as if I had been dipped in liquid stone. The skin didn't look like human flesh anymore. It was a flat, bloodless, cadaverous shell that had the hard, porcelain, lifeless texture of an old, abandoned church candle left to rot in a crypt. My fingers were locked into a permanent, narrow, claw-like curve, stiff and completely non-reactive to my brain's desperate, frantic impulses. I could hit my knuckles against the cold iron rim of the workbench, and it would produce a dull, hollow, sickening click, like a dry bone striking a stone gate, without sending a single drop of pain up my shoulder, because the nerves themselves had been carbonized and entombed within the wax. The fisherman's frame was back on the floor beside the table, boss, a twisted, broken heap. He was perfectly still now, his independent, malignant geometry completely shattered by the violent alkaline reaction. The black, carbonized arm that had held my wrist was nothing but a stump of white lime and charred, brittle bone, frozen into the hardened, stony paste on the floorboards like a prehistoric fossil of agony. The gray soup on his skull had dried into a featureless, cracked mask of white, brittle tallow that didn't hold a reflection or resemble my face anymore. The duplicate features had been boiled away by the acid, leaving only a blank, smooth, terrifying surface where the burned crater used to be, a face that had been wiped from existence. The county wouldn't be able to use the frame for an open crate viewing now. It was a ruined, unrecognizable carcass. The restoration was a total, abysmal failure by the handbook rules. I walked over to the zinc table, dragging my right boot with a heavy, rhythmic, dead weight scrape through the white chemical crust. The metal sheet of the gurney was cold now, the natural, sub-zero draft coming from the river foundations finally clearing the suffocating, necrotic heat out of the room. I picked up my iron spatula with my left hand, my fingers clumsy, numb, and stiff from the cold dawn, and began to scrape the remaining, jagged flakes of hardened, oily grease off the workspace. The midnight shift was secured, the ledger line was broken, but the price of balancing the book was etched right into the marrow of my own skin, a permanent, calcified mark that served as a reminder that I was no longer entirely the man who had started the shift. I was now half tallow, half bone, and entirely haunted by the grease that refused to leave my veins. By 6 a.m., the streetcars were grinding along the tracks of Decatur Street. Heavy vibrations traveled down through the lime-washed foundations of the St. Jude funeral house, causing the loose magnesium crust on my workbench to dance in tiny, nerve-jangling circles. The storm had broken, leaving a sickly gray drizzle that washed soot off the high grates and turned the river mist into a cold, translucent, suffocating sheet that clung to the skin like a wet shroud. I stood by the zinc table, my left hand mechanically packing my iron spatulas into my tool bag. My right arm hung at my side like a heavy, dead piece of carved, petrified tallow. The ash-white calcified crust had hardened in the cold, locking my wrist into a permanent, porcelain, unnatural curve. There was no pain, boss. Just a hollow, terrifying weight that didn't belong to a 26-year-old body, a silent, stony reminder that a piece of my own living alignment had been violently, mercilessly ripped away, leaving behind only raw, shredded nerves and blackened, bleeding gristle festering in the thick, oily mud. A deliberate, ominous step sounded on the wooden ramp. Miller, an old registry clerk, came down with a kerosene canister and the heavy, leather-bound intake book. He stopped, his boots crunching obscenely into the dry white paste on the floor. He looked at the shattered timber, the broken gas pipes, and the mangled, headless, lime-encrusted frame of the fisherman, its neck a jagged, weeping crater of exposed, charred bone and fused, bubbling meat that seemed to pulse in the dim light. "Jesus, James," Miller said, his voice flat, devoid of any humanity. "What kind of a slaughterhouse circus did you run? Did the pressure line blow again?" The humidity fouled the fuel, I said, buckling my bag with my left hand, my voice vibrating with hidden terror. The brass couldn't handle the thermal shift when the chute leaked. The line violently detonated and ruptured, spraying boiling, pressurized vapor before I could finish the second glaze on the skull. Miller walked to the frame. He didn't look closer at the white, blanched mask of tallow on the head, nor did he ask about the sweet, suffocating, stomach-turning stench of scorched, rotting human lard that hung over the bins like a physical weight. He nudged a piece of shattered beam with his boot. In the quarter, the day shift knew better than to audit a midnight breach if the numbers matched. Identification came from the harbor police, Miller muttered, opening the ledger on my zinc table. They checked the hull. Name was Arthur. A sister in Algiers signed the release. He drew a thick, final line through the registry. Family wants closed crate transport by noon. They don't have coin for an open viewing since the boat is a total loss. Put the broken, jagged plates in the lime bin and sign the log. He slid the heavy book over. I took the pen with my left hand. My right arm remained rigid, the dead, unervingly hard white knuckles clicking like loose, broken teeth against the metal gurney as I leaned forward. I forced my hand to write my name across the final line of the official record. Asterisk shift secured. Material loss, 3 gas globes, 1 beam. Frame checked, asterisk. I slung my bag over my shoulder and walked up the ramp into the biting morning air. The sun was breaking over the Mississippi, a cold, watery, mocking orange sliver. The yellow light turned the steam rising from the drainage grates into long, golden, suffocating ribbons that drifted over the iron balconies. Let me tell you something, boss. When you spend your youth filling the hollow valleys of the dead with a handful of hot, boiling grease, you learn that the county ledger isn't the only book kept in the dark. Every cypress cellar, every muddy canal, and every rusted engine room in the delta is just a layer of an old, cursed negative not yet cleared by the river wash. Sooner or later, when the humidity hits the right, discordant inversion, the past always finds a way to develop its own double right through the living skin of the man holding the spatula. My right boot dragged with a heavy, rhythmic, dead-weight scrape against the salt-crusted pavement as I walked toward the river. I could feel the cold dawn on my face, but on my right forearm, buried deep under the gray cotton sleeve, the wax stayed perfectly, impossibly warm, pulsing with a slow, mechanical heartbeat that told me the ledger was never truly closed.